You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Last summer, hundreds of people protested outside an ICE facility in Spokane. They were trying to stop agents from taking two asylum seekers to an ICE detention center in Tacoma. As the day wore on and the protest grew in size, law enforcement ordered demonstrators to disperse and then deployed pepper balls and smoke grenades onto the crowd. The mayor issued a curfew. By the end of the evening, around 30 people were arrested. But the government's response didn't end there. A month later, federal prosecutors indicted 9 Spokane protesters on felony conspiracy charges. In May, 3 of those protesters were found guilty of charges related to conspiracy to impede federal officers. They face up to 6 years in prison. It's an example of the escalating legal strategy the Trump administration has been using to charge anti-ICE protesters across the country, most recently in Minnesota. And according to new reporting, federal law enforcement turned to an atypical surveillance tactic to fuel the Spokane case. An investigation from Mother Jones found that the FBI secretly extracted data from protesters' cell phones confiscated during last year's protest. Skylar Mitchell is an assistant editor at Mother Jones, and she wrote the story. Skylar, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
How did you first come to this story out of Spokane and start looking into this case?
Yeah, so I've been following the Trump administration's crackdown on dissent over the past year. I've written about other conspiracy cases, and I was interested in this one because the Spokane Nine, as they're called, the 9 people who faced the federal conspiracy charges, when I started looking at that case, it hadn't gotten quite as much media coverage. And my colleague Sophie Hurwitz followed the beats of the case. But I was looking at the legal filings and I saw that there was an FBI agent who testified about using Cellebrite and Graykey, which are 2 phone cracking softwares, and testified about using that data in the investigation. And it's not unusual for the FBI to use these tools in its investigations. I was interested about the implication of taking phone extractions in what is fundamentally a case around protest and, potentially First Amendment rights. So I started following it then, and then I reached out to a couple of different sources. I saw that there had been reporting in Range Media, a local Spokane outlet last summer, where there were actually 23 people whose phones were seized during the mass arrest at that June protest, and they were wondering what had happened to their phones. And some people got them back within a couple weeks, other people it took longer. And from there, I was put in touch with somebody who'd obtained through a public records request to the Spokane Police Department about hundreds and hundreds of pages of records detailing the police reports last summer based on all the different arrests that had happened. And on one of those pages, I saw something that piqued my interest, which was that the FBI had taken extractions not just from the Spokane 9 phones, but actually it seemed like at least 13 different devices. And I should also say not all of the people that were defendants in the Spokane 9 trial were arrested at that initial protest. Some were identified later using facial recognition technology. So actually only one of the people who had their phone extracted on that list that I saw of those 13 devices, only one person was actually then indicted on federal charges.
So you already sort of partially addressed this, but I think it's important for people to understand who are listening to this. The FBI takes extractions from phones all the time, right? What is unusual about them doing that in the context of a protest like this? I know you talked to some free speech advocates and people like that about what makes this case stand out.
Yeah, well, this case was really shrouded in secrecy. So actually, the day before the FBI requested custody of these phones from the Spokane police, there was a memo that went out that was reported on by Reuters, went out to all of the top U.S. attorneys and encouraged prosecutors to aggressively pursue cases against anti-ICE protesters and people who they said were threatening law enforcement. And so, it comes amid this context of there were the mass protests in LA that week. There's this memo that goes out. And when I actually spoke with the chief of the Spokane police, he said that those phones that had been transferred to the FBI had been done so unbeknownst to him. Things kind of went outside the chain of command that he was used to, and all moved very, very quickly. So I don't know for certain if it's because of the memo, but this is the context in which this was happening. It was happening very quickly. And what's also interesting is that, like I mentioned, so there were at least 13 phones that I know for sure that the FBI said that they'd taken extractions from. Only one of those people were indicted on federal charges. So the government has to obtain search warrants to perform these phones. The Supreme Court has held that a search of a cell phone is considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. But the only way to actually know if there were warrants is if there are charges brought, because usually that information comes out in a legal case, like in the discovery process. But because only one of those people was ever charged, she took a plea deal actually in the fall. The people whose phones were extracted, their misdemeanor charges were dismissed. They never knew that their phones were extracted. So that is really hard to say, how common that is. It seems quite rare that there would be this mass arrest at a protest and then very, very quickly those phones would get sent over to the FBI.
And I just want to underline that. So we don't actually know if there were warrants in order to get access to the data on these cell phones, even though that is something that courts have ruled on, that law enforcement needs a warrant to go through your phone.
Yeah, it's possible that they did obtain them, but that information was not included in the Spokane 9 case. And yes, like the people who never had charges brought, so basically what one person said who I spoke with, he was like, this basically seems like a case in which the government, if they did obtain a warrant, had a blank check to hoover up everyone's data in this investigation and then ultimately bring these charges against the Spokane 9. Now, if they didn't have a warrant, then that raises concerns under the Fourth Amendment, which protects people from unlawful search and seizure. So yeah, and when I asked the FBI and the DOJ about this, they referred me to the Spokane 9 case. But again, the details about this particular incident are not in that. And then the other charges were dismissed against all of these people at the municipal and county level.
So 30 people were arrested. And as you say, there were 23 phones that were confiscated. It sounds like 13 of them had information actually extracted off of them. All of this went down under the nose of the police chief in Spokane. What has he had to say about this?
Yeah, well, he said when he found out that the phones had been transferred to the FBI, it caused, quote unquote, a little bit of consternation in his department just because they felt it was moving quickly and he wanted to understand who had ordered the transfer and really what was going on. So they'd hit pause on the transfer of evidence. But what I saw in the police reports that I obtained was that when that order to, pause things for a moment and figure out what was going on was issued, the detectives had actually already sent over all of the devices. And they say, explicitly that there was only one device left in their custody, which was a laptop. So the 23 phones appeared to have already been sent over. The other thing that the police chief said was that once they hit pause, later in that day, they received a subpoena from the FBI to actually seize the phones from the police department. And so this subpoena was issued after the phones had already been sent over. My understanding is that can sometimes happen in these quick moving investigations. But again, so he hit pause on the transfer of evidence to try to figure out what the appropriate legal pathway was, for kind of dealing with these different jurisdictions of investigations and the transfer of evidence. And the subpoena was issued after the phones had already been sent over. And again, that was just a subpoena for the FBI to take custody of the devices. It didn't include any information about a potential search or extraction.
What did the protesters you spoke to say when you told them about the FBI looking through these phones?
Yeah, one person was pretty unsurprised because she said that when she received her phone back from the police department, that her SIM card had been taken out and taped to the back of her phone. So she suspected that maybe it had been tampered with in some way. There was another person who said that when her phone was missing, she'd been receiving iCloud notifications that somebody was trying to log into her account in Seattle. And she speculated, well, the nearest FBI office is in Seattle. Maybe that's what's happening. I should also say a couple people who called the Spokane Police Department when their phones were missing, demanding answers. A couple people were told that the FBI had their phones. Of course, they didn't know what the FBI was doing with them. Other people weren't told anything. And there was actually a note in the police reports that I saw that explicitly said, don't tell people that the FBI has their phones. So there was definitely a bit of confusion too, just even around what basic information to tell people. But, we can't say what exact data the FBI was able to take. We don't know where that went, where it's being stored, how long it's being retained, if it'll resurface in future investigations, which is something that we've actually seen in legal cases in recent years. Data from phone extractions coming back down the line in different cases. So yeah, there's a lot of questions, and this process was certainly shrouded in secrecy. And so I think the protesters I spoke with were glad to know kind of what had happened last summer, but there's definitely still a lot of unanswered questions too.
Can you place the Spokane case kind of in context for us with what we've seen in places like the Chicago area, in now Minnesota, where protesters against ICE have been indicted on these conspiracies these conspiracy charges to impede federal officers. Now, there was a lot of fanfare when the Broadview, Illinois, the Chicago area protesters were had their charges dropped. At least on the left, you saw a lot of celebration. But I haven't really seen as much attention on this Spokane case where the three protesters were found guilty in May. And now this case in Minnesota is just ramping up, 15 defendants there. Can you just kind of give us a sense of the importance of Spokane in the context of all of that's been going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I found the guilty verdict in the Spokane case quite shocking because the other guilty verdict that we've seen really that's comparable is in Prairie Land, Texas, when this so-called Antifa cell was indicted on domestic terrorism charges over really just this kind of grouping of people that were at a protest, and they set off fireworks outside of a detention center.
But a cop got shot there, like a police officer was shot. And in Spokane, nobody was injured on the law enforcement or the protest side. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, no, so that's where I was going with that. So, that case kind of was in the news a lot, but again, yeah, a cop was shot. This case, yeah, nobody was hurt. And actually, the prosecutor who was initially assigned to this case resigned rather than bring the charges. And, he spoke very openly about the fact that he didn't feel like federal conspiracy charges were warranted in this case. And so the other thing too, with saying that it was this conspiracy, that people had intentionally, tried to impede or injure officers. Again, no one was injured, and actually, the verdict didn't find that anybody was injured. They just, ruled that there was a conspiracy to impede officers. But one of the people didn't, at least who was convicted, didn't know anybody else. He just stopped by the protest that day. I mean, that was what I heard from other people who weren't charged with conspiracy, but other protesters who'd been there. And actually, what was also interesting about this case was the two men who were detained at a routine immigration check-in. One eventually chose to self-deport, but the other, actually, a judge ordered him to be released from detention and found that his constitutional rights had been violated. So the initial kind of inciting event, even though this man who had been detained by ICE was eventually released, the people who had attended this protest to protest his wrongful detention are now facing years in prison. And just in terms of the other cases, I'll say this is definitely a tactic that we're seeing the Trump Justice Department use increasingly, targeting ICE protesters with these conspiracy to impede or injure officers charges. There, like you said, there was a case in Illinois that fell apart. There's this new case in Minnesota. And it's definitely concerning because we're talking about, First Amendment activity in many cases. If there's violence or, things go beyond the bounds of the law, that's, certainly something that will be decided in the courts. But, the types of evidence that we're seeing get cited in the indictments in these cases, are things like, wearing a t-shirt that says, I'm Antifa, which is like maybe a joke, but is being portrayed as this evidence of being a domestic terrorist. Or you see something even in the trial for the Spokane case, one of the pieces of evidence that was cited from one of the defendant's phones was that he discussed going to a protest on Reddit. And under questioning from the defense team, the agent testified, okay, well, yes, there was no evidence of criminal activity. So, talking about going to a protest on Reddit implicates our First Amendment rights. And so, definitely is something that civil liberties advocates are watching very closely as the administration continues to bring these types of cases.
Yeah, my question is, what is the bar for conspiracy when we're talking about people discussing protest and something that is a First Amendment protected activity? And now going forward, what will this mean for people organizing protests in the future? Is there anything else you want to say about this case, Skylar, and what happened in Spokane specifically, or the larger shift in legal strategy the Trump administration has been employing against protesters?
Yeah, I think the one other thing I'll say is just sort of to your last point is the sort of guilt by association, or as an advocate said to me about this case, like your mere proximity to somebody else can be used to justify an invasive search into your digital life. So, you know, with these conspiracy charges, I'm actually working on another piece about this. What these conspiracy charges are looking to do is, draw these connections between all these different people, and maybe they do know each other, maybe they don't. But, freedom of association is also, a right that we have in this country. And so, if you just go to a protest and maybe somebody else at the protest does do something unlawful, but does your mere presence or proximity at that event justify, your entire phone being extracted? And, what we know about these extractions is that, newer models of iPhone software can be pretty good at blocking these tools, but also, there are a lot of ways that these phone cracking tools get around different protections. And so, it is very possible for the government to be able to really get a full picture of your digital life. And, when that extraction happens, your digital life contains a lot of sensitive information. It's not just about protest activity. It might contain information about your medical history, about your religious affiliation, about, these personal details. And, this sort of segmenting of digital life and physical life isn't, in this day and age, really, there isn't really a firewall between those two things, right? Like our phones are a huge part of the way that we communicate and move through the world. So definitely this case raised a lot of concerns for me, and I'll be continuing to follow what type of evidence the government cites in future cases and how they seek to draw those connections and build those arguments about conspiracy.
Skylar Mitchell is an assistant editor at Mother Jones, and she reported on this case of the 3 Spokane protesters who were convicted on federal conspiracy charges related to a protest against ICE last June. That specifically that she reported on was that 23 phones were seized and 13 phones at the protest had data extracted as part of this case. Skylar, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.